We can get started. Hi everyone, my name is Alexandra Ages. I am the facilitator of today's session. I'm calling to you all from Treaty 6 territory located in beautiful Edmonton, Alberta. I'm the executive director over at the Council of Alberta University Students. I'm a queer woman and a part of the community. And in recent months and years, seen as we've had a lot more pushback and a lot of anti-LGBTQAIS rhetorics, this session was one that I thought would be just a wonderful opportunity to bring different folks together to discuss what queer joy looks like and what the community-based responses have been to this kind of backlash that we're seeing. So that's a little bit about me. I'll also apologize that I might sound a little sick. I'm just getting over COVID, but that's all good. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing different speakers. So thank you all so much for being here today. And I would love to give you all just the chance to have a quick introduction of who you are. We'll go Olivia, Miles, and then Nathan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. A big thank you to everyone who's in the viewing room. I'm so excited to sort of virtually meet you all and to engage in this conversation with everyone. I'm calling in from Antler River, which is the home of the Anishinaabek, the Haudenosaunee, Lūnaapéewak, and the Chictawton peoples. This is also Treaty 6 territory, though I'm not based in Alberta like Alex is. I'm actually based in London, Ontario, or otherwise known as London, Ontario. I, like many of us, am governed by, all of the treaty responsibilities and by other Indigenous relationship markers such as the dish with one spoon and the two-row wampum. And I take my relationship to this land and my relationship as a settler and a queer settler and someone who's gotten a lot of privilege to sort of walk, safely and comfortably through Canada as a queer person. I recognize that a lot of them has also come at the institution of colonial archetypes. And I have a lot of love and care for all of my Two-Spirit and other Indigenous queer kin who maybe are in the room today, maybe aren't, but who I share this land and place with. So that's a little bit about where I call from. I am currently a program manager at the Samuel Center for Social Connectedness, looking at what belonging means in different national, local, and international areas and thematic types, which I know sounds a bit complicated, but really it just means that I want to know what belonging looks like to different communities all over the world. And I get to sort of work in that. I'm interested in harm reduction and student advocacy and community-based change. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll turn over to Miles.
Hello, folks. It is so great to be here with you all today. My name is Miles Dykes. I use he, they pronouns, and similar to Alex, I'm calling in here from Edmonton or Amiskwaciy, Wisconsin on Treaty 6 territory. I've been able to live in Edmonton for about the past 5 or so years, and I find it so fascinating that this is an area that people have been coming to for thousands of years. And I think place-based relationships are becoming all the more important, and we're recognizing our connection to our land that we're on, and with that, also the traditional caretakers of that land. And so I'm extremely grateful to be here. I grew up in rural BC, essentially, and we had a stronger Indigenous culture there. And so coming to Alberta, it was really unique to see the way in which the socio-political environment had changed, and at times was a little bit more conservative. And I also was in the town of Lloydminster, if anybody's familiar with it, which is primarily oil and gas based. And so growing up, I didn't feel as though I had many supports, or that there were any other queer kids. And so coming to Edmonton was a life changer for me. I was able to get involved with community. I started university, and now I'm in my last year of my Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Economics. And I'm also involved in a couple ways in community, such as on the board of the Pride Center and working at the Fort Edmonton Foundation. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and I'll toss it over to Nathan.
Hi everyone, my name's Nate. My pronouns are he and him, and I've been a guest on Lekwungen territory here in Victoria, BC for 6 years now. I'm originally from Houston, Texas. I was born and raised on Francois territory. And yeah, I came here to finish school at UVic, and there I served as the UVic Pride Coordinator And since then, I've joined the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers, where I serve as the youth leadership coordinator, as well as the education coordinator. And I'm currently working on building technology for the Victoria Native Friendship Center to help address and reduce gender-based violence. And I think, like Miles, after moving from rather rural or more conservative space to BC, Canada, I was able to participate more in like student organizing and find that community where I was able to get in better touch with who I am as a person. And I think that I've done a lot of discovery with myself through my relationships with people. And I think that's the lens that I want to bring with me today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And thank you all so much for being here. It's just such a phenomenal group, and I'm really excited to hear from you all. So for our first question, just to dive right in, I'd like to ask each panelist, what does being queer mean to you? And along that line, what does queer joy mean to you? We'll go Miles, Olivia, and then Nathan, if that works.
So for queer joy, I would say that, or rather on being queer is about the ability to express yourself in an authentic way. And, you know, I think in our heteronormative world, that creates sometimes friction. There's one definition of queer that I really appreciate and look for inspiration to, and it's by Bell Hooks. She talks about being queer as not about who you're having sex with, though that is, of course, a dimension of it, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with the world around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. I used to think that, you know, being gay can be part of an identity, but I think it also shapes the way in which you view the world and the oppressive lenses that exist. And, you know, I really only saw a lot of the homophobia that was persistent, but as I grew and developed my relationships, I noted how interconnected all forms of oppression were. And I'm still very much learning on that angle. But, you know, I think being queer is about being authentically yourself in relation to all of that oppression, resistance. And I think queer joy is an act of resistance. And when the world is telling you that who you are is wrong or immoral or unnatural, I think to be proud of who you are is an act of joy and resistance. And that is what queer joy is all about. Well, since time immemorial, really, queer people have been acting as resistors. And, you know, looking to more recent history, for our community to survive, we had to be outspoken and to resist. And so, yeah, I really think that queer joy is about recognizing our history, being authentically ourselves, and working for the best of our community.
I got so caught up in Miles' answer that I was just like, nice. No, of course. And then didn't realize that it would be my turn next. Thank you for that answer, Miles. I think that was really, really wonderful. I think first and foremost, to me, being queer, really quite parallel to Miles, is both an identity and also a political act. There's politics involved with being queer. I think you can, I think you can be part of the community. You can be someone who, might be in a queer relationship, but who isn't necessarily involved in these sort of, political action, or is involved in community organizing, or isn't involved sort of in other ways. But your existence doesn't become less political. You might not be sort of leaning on that, but you are still sort of trying to show up in a world that doesn't necessarily want you to exist in many different ways, or doesn't want you to show up and be proud in many different ways, or doesn't want you to be loud. And so, leaning off of Miles, I do think it's about authenticity. But for me, queerness has also been an active politic. It has been questioning, what do I think is right? What do I think is valid? What are the histories associated with the systems and the structures in place that I had historically followed? I often say that I came out later in life, which isn't totally true. It was my final year of university, a whopping 22, but it feels later in comparison to many others, because I was sort of exiting that time where my political self as a student advocate was leaving. I was entering the workforce. I was totally sort of moving away from that, and in turn my queer politics entered when I was in my when I was in the workforce. It entered in community organizing. It sort of got to thrive working at an HIV/AIDS serving organization where almost everyone around me was talking about queer resistance and was talking about our history and was talking about what it meant to, during the HIV/AIDS crisis, to see your community die. And so that was sort of like where my, time of realizing myself came to, slightly before, but that's really where it got to bloom. And so I can never really separate queerness from the politics of questioning and the politics of seeking authenticity. As for queer joy, I always am just like, it's love. And that's it sounds almost like a cheesy answer, like you'd put it on like a Target shirt. But for me, it really has been love. It's been, love in terms of, sort of my romantic relationships, but much broader than that. It's been love in community. It's been finding other people who want to challenge the system. It's been finding other people who want to laugh and who want to be loud and who want to just sit with one another and share in this identity, but also what it brings us. Quite recently, some friends of mine have started a queer collective over here in London. It's called Late Bloomers, for anyone who's based in London and tuning in. And they've been organizing, dances and events and book readings. And they've been, we've been organizing to go to protests together. And I'm like, that's it. Like, that's what I want queerness to be. I want it to be community. I want it to be being with one another. I want it to be poetry on Friday nights. And then I want it to be dances. Like, I want it to be this true plethora of experiences where we consistently call people in and where we say, like, we are united against all forms of oppression. We are together in this, and let's show up together. So yeah, for me, it really sits with love. And yeah, I'll pass over to Nathan.
Thank you, Olivia. When I think about queerness, to me, I understand it as something that has shaped all of my relationships between myself, between my family, and the people around me. And what Miles really resonated with me in that when I was younger and I didn't necessarily have a handle on all the language, there was a lot of friction when it came to understanding myself and my family and others understanding me. And it wasn't until I came out here and started growing into myself in college and I did start to understand like the language and identity and not necessarily label who I am, but understand that I can exist in multiple spectrums in relation to queerness. It really helped me to foster understanding with important people to me, like my family, like community members, other people in my culture, and people here, of course. And for me, I think that that's one of the primary elements of queer joy for me is understanding. And one of the things that gives me a lot of hope and joy is seeing even younger and younger people and children coming into their own queerness and people around them respecting it and maybe not necessarily understanding it off the bat, but trying to. And a lot of joy for me comes out of the idea that they're going to be able to grow up with healthier and stronger relationships to themselves and the people around them. Yeah, and I think that's all I'd like to share for this question. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you to all three of you for just your reflections on what queerness can look like. I really appreciate that there are those common threads of the political elements and the active resistance. And on that note, in recent months especially, we've seen an upsurge in a lot of this anti-2STQLGBIA plus rhetoric. A lot of hatefulness has been very prominent across Canada and around the world. To that effect, I'd like to ask everyone, have you seen this within your own communities? And if so, what has resistance looked like within that local context? So I think to start things off, we'll go with Nathan and then Olivia and then Miles.
I feel like in my experience, I'm seeing like a structural or systemic form of oppression or violence towards 2S LGBTQ people, specifically trans and non-binary folk. In my line of work, supporting family violence programs, I see strong and beautiful programming for men, women, and children. However, statistically, I think the understanding is that trans and non-binary people experience unprecedented and higher rates of violence than those other groups. And yet there's that gap in programming and services that speaks to those challenges and the unique strengths and experiences that trans and non-binary people carry with them. On the other side of that, what does resistance to it look like? I'm seeing youth leadership doing the work to create resources for community that are essentially around like language and the diversity of sexual orientation and gender identity and even relationality and relationships. They take all sorts of different ways. And one of the things that inspires hope for me in that work is that it's been done in good faith that there are people in community who want to understand and want to be respectful and want to create this environment for our trans and non-binary siblings and those of us that are facing a lot of oppression and violence. Yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah, I think London's definitely been a bit of a hotspot for anti-trans and anti-2S LGBTQI+ rhetoric. We've had a real surge in the number of protests, particularly school-oriented protests, looking to really center families instead of centering kids. So this idea that, trans kids, they don't exist. It's all sort of being forced upon them. Parents should be informed. If their kid is using different pronouns, they shouldn't have the privacy of, trying out different pronouns. I'm seeing a lot of this narrative, particularly in London and kind of surrounding, but, I'll speak to London, that, kids are questioning and that is bad. Or if kids are questioning, then they can't be certain and therefore they shouldn't be afforded the privacy of engaging in that experience. And I always think like, yeah, we all question lots of stuff. You let those kids question that's a fine thing. That's actually the whole part of the process. But we have seen a lot of those protests in London. We've seen several at the schools. I've been to several sort of outside City Hall as counter protesters, and then sort of walked across, the park nearby and seen massive counter protests, or counter pre-protests, and we're the counter protest, if that makes sense. And it's been really quite disheartening, because I think that there's also a lot of services that are actually thinking about trans kids. And I loved what Nathan just said about in good faith. There is programming. There's a really popular, the biggest youth program in London right now is a queer D&D youth program at the library. And it is like really specific to queer kids and allowing them to question and explore and, play through characters, how they might, imagine themselves in the world, which is engaging in storytelling about yourself. We're also seeing an uptick in, sort of like local businesses and people and services and library programs and universities supporting LGBTQ+ people. But we're also seeing greater acts of protests. We're seeing a larger call to sort of call your city representative and call your school trustee in particular and really get that out of here. We're seeing a, increase in actual number of hate crimes. Though this hasn't been, sort of reported. I have friends who and I were talking this morning about how someone walked by them and spit all over their car. I have other friends who are getting heckled more, who are being yelled at. We had for quite a period of time no gay bar in the city. That's now changed, which is lovely. And we have other places that stepped up to host events with us and to really engage in that kind of organizing. There was a real period of time here where I was like, I'm not safe in this city. And if I, a straight passing white woman, who identifies as a woman, if I don't feel safe, like I'm the tip of the privilege iceberg, or at least one of them, where like I have these different safety nets. And I was so fearful for so many people in my life. And I think I'm really thankful that many people in the queer community here have engaged in organizing. They've started collectives. They've been bugging other places to hold events. They've been, responding with protests. I was quite sort of moved, and then I'll move on to Miles, but I was quite moved. Earlier this summer, there was a pride in my community, like sort of in my specific neighborhood. And there was this call that there was some counter protest to this pride because there was a drag story time. And they were like, we're going to have 80 to 100 people here, like we're going to shut down this entire village pride. And 8 people showed up on sort of that, like, we're going to shut it down side, and 100, 200 people showed up to support this drag story time. Adults sort of sectioned off the entire park. I was one of them. People created like sound barriers so that the kids who were at our local village, like it's not a village, but it's called a village pride, local neighborhood pride, could listen to drag story time. And so that really moved me to see so many allies, you know, allies with their kids, people with their kids showing up and saying like, queerness is good. We're happy to have you here. And to have so many people I knew sort of creating that wall of protection for other young queer kids. But it has been concerning, but I am quite hopeful because of the responses I've seen. Thank you.
Similar to Olivia, you know, we've definitely seen the same types of activities taking place in Edmonton as it relates to 2S LGBTQ plus anti 2S LGBTQ plus protests. And it's been very disheartening. I think, you know, a lot of economic inequalities were worsened, heightened, exacerbated by the pandemic. And during the pandemic here in Alberta, we also saw, you know, a healthy population of people very unsatisfied with the COVID-19 restrictions. And I think that that kind of political will is still driving forward a lot of the homophobia, the transphobia that's existing here in our capital region now. You know, I think that with Alberta, I always wonder what's going on with American politics that will influence us. I feel like that's one of the dead ringers for when that was a motivator for me to get involved when I saw things getting more serious in the States about a year ago, whether it was legislation surrounding trans kids or drag queens performances. I just thought it was so absurd. And, you know, slowly enough, this past summer, there was a protest against a drag story hour in Calgary. And then that momentum began to grow. And, you know, on September 21st across Canada, we saw people march for what they called the 1 million children, something to that effect. And like Olivia said, this centered along the notions of parental rights and, well, largely invalidating the rights of their children. And so with this, you know, there's been a lot of challenging and harmful narratives that have come out of the protests, with the worst being that, you know, queer people are pedophiles. And as a survivor of sexual violence, I take that one very personally. You know, I think that if anything, we as the queer community are championing what consent looks like, acknowledging each other's experiences and validating that, because, you know, who else can know your experience but other queer folks? And so, you know, within that, there's also been a lot of resistance at a localized level. There is always those counter protests. And for the September 21st one, it was really great on campus seeing there was a lot of worry about it. What did this mean for people's safety? But there was also a lot of unity in the counter protest, and people were in our Pride Center creating signs and making them together. And it became, you know, a therapeutic art project in the middle of this existential dread almost, I would say. And so, yeah, I think that there's still a lot of work and resistance to go on Alberta as we're continually seeing these hateful narratives resurface. And it's so important for that reason to support the nonprofits in Edmonton that are targeting and delivering services towards queer youth or queer people in general. You know, there's the iHuman Center, there's Youth Empowerment Social Services, there's the Pride Center, of course. There are just so many great services in our city that need support, and that is an act of resistance to this persistent homophobia in our society that seems to continue to persist, but that just means that we have to continue to resist and use that as inspiration.
Thank you so much for that. It's interesting how, oh yeah, Miles.
Sorry, you were muted for that 1 second.
Thank you all for that. It's interesting that within those narratives, there is that strong focus on youth, on family rights, on the kind of narrative that children are somehow inherently endangered by queer people. It's interesting for me. I first came out at 13. And while it wasn't that long ago, it was still a time when the only real representation we had was just Glee, and that was it. But looking back, it often, even though the representation has increased, I personally feel like for a lot of young queer people, the difficulties of coming out have only really increased in recent years. Just because there has been such a strong cultural pushback to the narratives of queerness. And on that note, I'm wondering what each of you would say to a young person who is questioning their sexuality, their gender identity, and perhaps looking and considering to come out or not looking and considering to come out. So I think we'll go Miles, Nathan, and then Olivia.
All right. Well, thinking to myself, I unabashedly knew I was different, other growing up. And I finally had the language about when I was 13 of what being gay was. And, that language has still kind of evolved as I've found the terminology queer. And I find that's more representative of who I am, as, I find that being gay exists within more of that, hetero versus homo binary. And I don't know how true, like, we conflate and create binaries, but are they just artificial in nature? And I think we live, in a world that is socially constructed, and there are these beliefs about people's bodies that aren't based in science. And I think that for myself, or for any, I want to redirect it more to queer youth or people struggling with their identity. I think finding safe spaces is one of the best places. I think that I really became confident and embraced my queer identity when I was around people who I felt safe with. And they weren't queer folks, many of them, but they were people that I felt that I could come out to. And, in a rural town that maybe didn't have too many queer folks, that was the best thing I could ask for. And now we have, social media and information that's continually all the more prevalent, with perspectives from people who weren't traditionally uplifted. And hopefully people take learnings from that. Ultimately, I think we need to do a better job for our youth, because I still think that so many people are terrified to come out or to be different, or, to be perceived as different. Though there's nothing fundamentally wrong or unnatural about being queer. It's observed in nearly every animal species. And, if anything, I think that being completely heterosexual would be the unnatural thing, like we've stratified this to be the structure. But yeah, that's what I'd have to say.
Thank you, Miles. For myself, I think that coming into one's identity and the process of coming out are both staggered processes in and of themselves. I think we learn things about ourselves little by little, sometimes on our own and sometimes through others. But coming out in a good way happens with the people we trust most first, and then expands from there, growing with how we express ourselves and with whom. I think the most important things someone who is navigating identity and coming out can give themselves is patience. The journey requires a lot of bravery, and I think each step should happen at that individual's pace and should center their safety and well-being ultimately. I know for myself, it was very much reliant on time and place. I didn't feel like I could come out or explore myself that way until I was out of Texas. Go figure. But coming here and meeting other queer people and meeting queer allies, and just learning about how everybody is represented within this, every facet of society, whether it's religion, race, creed, anything, there's queer people from there. And learning how they've navigated it through their own lives, and them feeling brave and safe enough to do that, I think really really gave me the opportunity to come into myself. And I think that, I feel very grateful for my brave community members who are willing to share those sorts of things with me. And for the spaces where I was able to explore those things with them in a good way.
first want to sort of reflect like very briefly on, you know, my own experience coming out, and then I'll sort of address more specifically to queer youth. I think I was really fortunate, you know, growing up in Victoria, BC, and then sort of moving to London, even if it's a little more conservative in Victoria, BC. I have very supportive parents who took me to pride parades as a kid. Like it truly wasn't a big deal. We were going to the pride parade, and then it was Pride Month, and that wasn't anything that was ever seen as negative. It was just a fact. I remember when when we have any parents or educators, you know, in the room, I remember being a kid and my parents talked about relationships. They also talked about, if you ever bring home a boy, if you bring home a girl, if you bring home someone, like, you know, we care about how they treat you. We don't really care about the rest. And even with parents who I think are objectively very supportive, I remember the stress and the fear of realizing, like, I'd been questioning for several years. I had, you know, never sort of officially identified, and having a moment of like, no, like I am queer. I'm not maybe queer. I'm not like girls are pretty queer. I'm not, this is just a girl crush. It was like a moment, and this might be, you know, I think different for women or people who identify as women, where there's a lot of compulsory heterosexuality, and a lot of the way that women talk about male partners can even be like, oh, you know, I don't like hanging out with him. I'm just with him because. And I think that was sort of an old heteronormative narrative that you aren't really supposed to like your partner. And in turn, that keeps you boxed into thinking, well, you know, if I'm not that interested in this person and I just like them as a friend, you know, that must be, that's it. That's a relationship. And so I remember that sort of moment of like being like, no, I'm definitely queer. I'm so nervous to tell my family. I've already told my friends. A couple of them went, yeah, duh, which was funny, but, you know, its own moment in itself. So coming out, I think even with supportive families is scary. And I was very fortunate that they were like, yeah, that sounds great. We're not worried about it. We love you very much. Moving on. And so I think for me, it was worth sort of moving through that. It was worth saying, it was worth having this big loud moment of like posting on Instagram, calling everyone, being like, I'm queer and I'm dating a woman. This is the new me. But not everyone has to do that. And so I really, you know, I share my experience, say like, that's one way of living as a queer person. That's one version of the coming out story. But coming out is a really individual experience. And for a lot of people, it doesn't exist. It can also be a really culturally relevant, very sort of like Western world conceptualization of what it means to walk in the world as a queer person. And so if you're someone who is like, you know, I don't know if I ever want to post on Instagram and call my mom and tell them, hey, I'm queer, like, you're not less queer, you're not less valid, you're not less part of the community. It really is such a personal and important thing. But I would say to queer youth in particular, and echoing Nathan, like, you can come out if you choose to at your own pace, at your own time, with safe people. But I do encourage you to know that there is an entire world of yourself that is worth discovering. It is worth sitting with. It is worth loving. It is worth caring for. Whether you love it temporarily, you might say I'm queer, and then one day go, oh, actually, I wasn't. That's okay. That didn't make it less valid or less important. If it's permanent, if it's just private, if it's only with others that you sort of share. I mean, I don't mean others even necessarily romantically. I mean others like telling your friends, feeling like a part of a community. I cannot encourage enough that process of exploration, because as I said before, queerness is also political. It's about authenticity. It's about questioning. It's about seeking out different ways of being. Do that. It's worth doing it. There's like not to be all far, but there's a garden inside yourself. Water it. And those who love you and care for you will help you water that garden. So it's to queer in particular, who I have lots of queer love for. This like, oh, we're gonna pave better ways for you when you're already paving your own better ways.
That was really beautiful. And thank you to all three of you for the little bits of pieces of just vulnerability that came out in that last question. That was really, really lovely. I'm going to go off script slightly and create a new question. But one of the narratives that I really like coming from all three of you is also the importance of that place-based community and what that's really looked like. I know for me, as someone who also grew up in Victoria, I was really lucky when I was still in high school to discover what was then known as AIDS Vancouver Island. which had a ongoing queer youth group that was taking place, and just being physically all together in this little space and having that opportunity to talk about our identities and who we were was so meaningful. So I would love to learn a little bit more from all three of you about what some of the different place-based community building efforts are currently looking like for you as locals coming from all across Canada. We'll start with Nathan and then go to Olivia and then Miles.
When I think about place-based community initiatives, creating a space for queer people, I think about, well, civil society is a lot like what you mentioned. Well, I'm living in Victoria right now, and I think that's one of the most beautiful things about where I'm living right now is that plethora and variety of social services and organizations like AIDS Vancouver Island, like the Friendship Centers, like Transcare BC. And I'm seeing things like community lunches where we have opportunities to mix and mingle with people from every walks of life, whether they are secure economically and financially and socially, or are struggling a bit, or their leadership in the community. I think that those sorts of spaces where people can come together and connect with each other is not only enriching, but it's also inspiring hope for people who are younger and connecting with older folks. Earlier, I think somebody mentioned the AIDS epidemic. And I think for the queer community, that essentially robbed us of access to queer elders and completely disrupted the transfer of like knowledge and wisdom that we've built up as a community, and also as almost like a culture. And I think that creating more of those spaces where youth and elders can connect and share wisdom and insight and things that they're going through can remedy a lot of things that we're struggling now with like the homoeroticism, homophobia, and hate, and even loneliness that we're seeing in our queer elders right now. You know, yeah, I hope that answers well.
It's a great question, Alex. When I think about place-based community building, I've been pretty fortunate to have spent a fair amount of time in a couple different provinces in Canada, and I think that they each have very distinct ways of engaging in sort of place-based organizing. I haven't lived in Victoria since I was quite young in high school, but I think about how a lot of it always comes together around being near the ocean, being in a sort of naturally environmentally rich place, and how that sort of changes the amount of climate change efforts that exist. And I think about being in Halifax and being really involved in the art community there, and how that changed the way I was doing organizing, the way I was involved. And so specifically for London, we're sort of this little, we're not landlocked, well, we are landlocked, but it's not quite the same as being on a coast to coast. It's this lake city that's near Toronto. People kind of leave, they kind of are transient through, they're here for university. And so it's looked a lot of different ways for me at different stages. And so what I can say to people who are in university is get involved with all the different things you want to get involved with. As someone who was, really involved in student organizing and then really involved in student politics, and who dropped in at a club every 3 months and felt kind of embarrassed about it because I hadn't been there the 2, 3, 4 sessions prior. It's worth doing that just to sort of see how other people are approaching the work and how you might bring queerness to it. I think about as part of the Social and Peace Club, and how, one of my focuses when I was there was I was like, I just really want to talk about like gender and equity, and I want to do stuff downtown for that. And so then I joined other clubs and other people and got to occupy different ways. And when you leave university, and I am coming as someone who's been out of university now 4 years, you have to find other ways of doing organizing. You have to find other communities. And that also means you have to go to things. Truly, as someone who works in nonprofits, we want nothing more than people to attend the events that we organize. Thinking about even this conference, we want nothing more than people to attend and to get connected. And I cannot recommend enough for anyone listening or anyone who listens to the recording after to figure out what your local AIDS chapters doing. Often many of them have rebranded to HIV/AIDS spaces, or they've rebranded to 2SLGBTQ service centers. Find one of them. They're probably hosting movie nights. They're probably hosting a queer youth group. They're probably hosting something with harm reduction, which I think people should all be involved in. Go to the events. They want you there more than I think. There's often free food. In terms of also then just like finding community, I think it starts with kind of going to those events, and then sometimes it means building your own community. I speak really highly of the Late Bloomers Collective here in London that was started by a friend of mine, because they've changed the entire queer scene in London. You know, we often talk about how much we wanted to have nights where we went out, or how we wanted to have poetry readings, where we wanted to have letter writing campaigns, and we were frustrated that it was just the two of us. And he, currently working at a regional HIV/AIDS connection here, with another person at a coffee shop, started this queer collective. And now we have all those things that we were talking about doing for ages. And so sometimes when you can't find community, you have to build it. You have to go to the events, you got to find one person, and then you have to co-build your own community, because other people are thinking the exact same thing as you. They're thinking about loneliness, they're thinking about isolation, they're thinking about the need to have free events and programming. And there's definitely the resources to do so. So yeah, sorry, that was kind of a long-winded answer. But in my defense, it was thrown at us here.
Wow, that was really beautiful, Olivia. And I love hearing about the late bloomers. That collective just sounds so inspiring. And I'm like, is there something like that already going on in Edmonton? Because if so, I need to be a part of it. But yes, place-based community engagement has been something really important to me throughout my life. From a young age, I remember being on the docks, on the community garden along the docks in my hometown, where my mom with a couple of other women were replanting everything. And this was an element of community and connection, creating a beautiful space for the town residents. And there were a lot of days in my youth that were spent like that, though I think I was mostly terrorizing the boardwalk as I was riding around on a little bike. But that connection to community really stayed with me. As I moved to Lloydminster, I got involved with the Youth Centre, which was a great programming space for youth, whether it was for activities that were like physical activities. They had trips you could attend. And for myself, they also invested into my leadership development. They invested in me going to a Rotary Youth Leadership Camp. And this camp was based in Jasper. And it was one of the first places that I ever felt truly seen and acknowledged. And it wasn't because this was a queer youth camp or anything like that, but it was a youth camp that had other queer people. And I found that I was able to connect with them, and their stories were amplified. There was this one leader who talked about her life as a queer woman and tackling her her history as a survivor of sexual violence. And I was so empowered by that, because I'd never heard anybody, frankly, I don't think, be in a similar position to myself, or who I felt like was in a similar position to myself. And so every place I go, I find that I'm looking to get involved with something. When I moved to Edmonton, I had been involved with that Rotary program prior. So, it's closer to Edmonton. It's necessary for me to get involved. There's so many benefits from it as well, whether it's to the community. You're building a capacity building program that's going to inspire and hopefully build the leaders of tomorrow. But, more intrinsically, I suppose, you're developing your self-confidence, you're creating connections. And admittedly, at that time, I think that was one thing I'd really struggled with. And so, thinking of place-based community engagement in Edmonton, I know there are some incredible offerings already, whether it's, say, what Sage, they have, what is it called? Forums for elderly queer people who are looking for a community. Similar with the Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers and the Pride Center, there are forums weekly for newcomers trying to talk about their experiences and what does that look like as, They may be able to be out in Canada, but they may not feel safe with the concept of being out. And one thing I just wanted to talk about that Nathan had touched on was the importance of intergenerational learning and having mentors and young people come together and challenge each other's ideas and learn from one another. I think that so many of my mentors have been significantly older than me and mainly female. But, you know, I think that it's incredible, the wealth of knowledge within them. And that's knowledge that we don't want lost. Yes, thank you.
Thank you all for that. Kind of going on to that intergenerational piece that came up, Nathan really hit on the issue that we have had that incredible, devastating loss of a lot of queer elders within the community, which we know is because of the AIDS epidemic, as well as a variety of more long-standing issues where people in different time periods haven't felt safe to come out or even join the community, and a lot of the political conflicts that arose and impacted queer elders. Looking at that, though, there's also that very strong and beautiful interwoven history of queer resilience and queer resistance. So within all three of your work, I would love to learn a little bit more about how do you honor that history? How do you celebrate that intergenerational knowledge? And really look to those who walked before us as our elders, even if they might not physically be with us anymore. So I'd love to hear from Olivia, Nathan, and then Miles, if that works.
That's such a great question. I think that's like trifold. We'll go trifold. First, I think it's really important, if not hard, to hold that history, to not let it get swept under the rug, to learn about the different mechanisms that cause the HIV/AIDS crisis, what sort of caused it to continue, the political disregard for, political disregard for people dying with AIDS, the sort of, lesbian resistance to that, and all the different lesbians who took care of, gay men during that time period. That's part of why the acronym was changed from GLBTQ to LGBTQ, to recognize the, care the lesbian community gave to gay and bisexual and men who have sex with men during the AIDS epidemic. So I think it's holding some of that oppression, some of that violence, holding the histories that don't necessarily immediately intersect with you, thinking about transphobia, thinking about the Stonewall riots, thinking about the sort of Montreal Pussy Palace riots, like holding all that history, both immediately next to you, so within the context of Canada, and then also sort of around the world, and not letting it get swept under the rug, because the narratives that we see surrounding homophobia and transphobia today are just repackaged historical narratives. The idea that, people who do drag, people who are trans or grooming kids is just what they said about lesbians and gay people and other queer people like 30 years ago. Maybe not even 30 years ago, maybe 20. So again, holding all the history, not letting it swept under the rug. And then at the exact same time, I think it's about learning about all the different forms of queer joy. It's, and going, all the way back, reading about sort of, people who are queer in ancient times, or for me, that'd be like, reading Sapphic poetry, reading Sappho's poetry in particular, that then also looks like learning about ballroom, and it looks like learning about drag and the histories of ballroom and drag. It looks like learning about the different ways that queer people have congregated throughout time, and really holding that joy. Because queer people have always been joyful. We're going to continue to exist regardless of the different faces old and new of oppression against us, and we're going to continue to dance the whole way through. That's just something that queer people have always done. And then I think in terms of my immediate life, I actually do try to seek out queer elders, and I was really fortunate because when I first left school, I got to work in the HIV/AIDS sphere, which was very, very queer. And so I cannot recommend enough trying to find queer mentors, whether they be sort of like only 10 years older than you, or 20 years older than you, or 30 or 40 years older than you, trying to find those spaces where there is intergenerational connection. And it's actually reminding me that I need to go find and seek some of those connections again. Because in my current work, I really am, I'm not working with a lot of queer people, a lot of people who are cool with queerness, but not directly queer and part of the community. And so in my immediate work, the way I honor those queer histories because I run a program that's based in research, is by trying to shift resources to researching that history, to shift resources to hiring other queer people, shift resources to engaging in projects that are about queer joy. So yeah, that's sort of what I do in my various steps of how I operate and honor all the queer people who laid the way for me to be able to, you know, get in an apartment with my girlfriend without sort of facing a lot of fear. And really those kind of small acts of getting to live my life the way I would like to live it with communities that I love so dearly. Thank you.
For myself and in my work, working with youth leadership, it's important to me to elevate and bring in queer elders in general, right? Not necessarily as just like a one-off or special kind of event, but they're there regularly. And I think it's important because as we're growing up and we're forming our identity, it doesn't stop in our late 20s. I think we're always forming our identity. And bringing in somebody who's queer and older and has been on a journey that has that similar element, I think can inspire hope in our youth. And I think that's important too, because we were not all of us are exposed to happy, healthy, queer elders or adults in our lives. You know, like people in our community face all sorts of discrimination, whether it's to housing or income security through jobs or healthcare. And our lifetimes, I mean, our lifespans can reflect that, you know, like I think being young and not seeing these elders and adults around you, that's a significant gap, you know, and exposing our youth to more of that just will inspire hope. And I feel like I'm straying from the question, Alex. Do you mind repeating it?
Just looking a little bit at honoring queer histories and honoring queer elders and how to really incorporate and celebrate those histories into your work. But I feel like you really hit the nail on the head about, you know, having living elders there to kind of bridge those intergenerational divides. So it's beautiful work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So for myself, I think there are just so many learnings from the history of our community, of us persisting and resisting. Like Olivia was talking about, so many of the homophobic narratives that we're seeing now came out of the moral panic that originated in the 70s. And so I think we have a lot to learn from the organizing efforts and activism of that era. And, you know, I think there are some amazing initiatives that work to center that. Admittedly, I think I have a lot more to learn from our elders, our queer elders, and also reading more from those who have passed and been our torchbearers for our community. Thinking about more of the legacy of resistance within Edmonton, you know, I think that the Edmonton Queer History Project has been a really great facet to showcase the queer history of Edmonton. As, you know, if you're newer here, it seems as though the presence of queer people is relatively new. But, you know, at least with this queer history project, we're going all the way into the 70s with the Pisces spa raid, and then going into, you know, the HIV and AIDS epidemic, and as well as the near constant harassment from police until the 2000s. So within my work, I try and reflect queer narratives into it. I work at the Fort Edmonton Foundation partially, and one thing that I'm trying to do is to reflect how queer people were in Edmonton's earlier history in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I don't know if there's much research around this, but I've been trying to find this. I think that joy and resistance has been a facet of our existence forever. And so we know queer people also existed 100 years ago. It's just that their situations maybe weren't as public. And another way that I try and serve and remember the history of our community is by working on the Pride Center board. The organization was founded about 50 years ago and has been a service and program delivery organization for that whole time, creating community for those who needed it most. Now, in the last couple of years, we've had to do a drastic strategy change, realizing that we were catering to one specific type of queer person, and that's generally white queer men. But the history and the experiences of queer people is so much more diverse than that. And the Pride Center needs to reflect that. We need to reflect on the newcomers and refugees who are here, the people who exist within the gender binary, anything like that. I think that we really, I lost my train of thought, but yes, that.
Thank you for that, Miles. I love learning a little bit more about what the Pride Center here is doing. It's always cool to get those added insights about just kind of that local perspective. Looking at kind of some of the role of queer elders and the different people in our lives who kind of help shape that path we walk. I think back to one of the first queer elders I met who I first encountered when I was volunteering at AIDS Vancouver Island, named Phil. And Phil was very outspoken about his experiences of having gone to jail in the 80s and contracting AIDS there as a gay man, and sort of how he ended up then collecting cans, selling them, paying his way to go back to school, and then giving back to community, and just all of the different insights he had for generations of queer life in Victoria was so beautiful. Phil's since passed, but he remains just one of those individuals that had such a big impact on me because I was, 18 when I first met him, and he was incredible. So I'd like to open the floor to all of you to talk a little bit about who are your current queer inspirations that you're finding, be they individuals at the local level or people throughout our incredible pages of history that you find resilience and queer joy in. I think we'll go to Miles and then Nathan and then Olivia.
For myself, I think I find, honestly, a lot of the inspiration in queer people from the people around me. I'm thankful to have so many queer friends, and I'm continually inspired by their passion, their curiosity, their want to continually improve and do better for our community. And I think that is so vital. And I think of yourself, Alex, who is continually thinking of ways in which we can support the most vulnerable in our societies, whether that's from a race-based lens, a class-based lens, those who've experienced violence. And so I'm very thankful for a lot of my friends who have opened my eyes to other people's experiences that exist with outside mine. And, one person that I think they've become more, they're American, and they have been a prominent advocate for speaking towards non-binary and trans kids. Now, I can't speak to their previous work, but more recently, with a lot of the pushback against for parental rights, rather, and people really questioning, is this something we should support kids in? I think Jonathan Van Ness, they've been a great advocate in that way. They were in a podcast with Dax Shepard this fall, and it was interesting to see how still such a public figure can have their words twisted and used, but then beyond that, they sought a recorrection of the record. And I think that was extremely powerful in the sense that I think that often when you're put into those high pressured environments where you're given a platform, you speak authentically from that moment, but then exiting that, they can capture and cut that to however you want. And then for Jonathan Van Ness to speak out and face ramifications, whether it's business, personal, or whatnot, I think was extremely important because it is often easier to be silent. And I think that they're using their voice to support trans and non-binary kids who are some of the most vulnerable in our societies right now. And, I think that there's, with leadership and inspirations, I think we have this idea that they all have to be perfect, but this idea of perfectionism is very, very concentrated in our Western mindsets, that there is this purest form of something. But in reality, we need to accept each other as full humans and our lived experiences and our faults with that. And I just saw a name in the chat as well, Dr. James McCocus, incredible speaker, activist, doctor, person. Yes, thank you.
Sorry, was I next? Okay. For myself, I would have to say it would be my queer ancestors. My mother had a gay godfather and we had a trans uncle. who were both very loving and took care of me and the other youth in my family, and were very active parts of our lives and were very joyful parts of our lives until they eventually passed on. And now I see myself as one of the older people in my generation, and I'm seeing nieces and nephews and younger cousins coming into their own queerness. And growing up, I didn't know that my uncles were queer people. That just wasn't something that was talked about or was shared in our family, whether it was because of the time, the place, or both. But, you know, growing up and having to figure out my relation to queerness on my own and not understanding that context added another layer of difficulty for sure. But now that I'm in this place and I'm seeing this younger generation come up, I want to be very authentic and open with who I am and my life, because I want for them to know that, as you know, that like there's so many different challenges that we all face, but I want for them to know that as they get older, all sorts of things are possible. And I think that's where I draw my inspiration from.
Lovely answers. It's been really like lovely to hear all of your responses, and they've made me think differently about some of, you know, my pre-written notes. I think there are sort of two spaces that I'm drawing the most inspiration from lately. I'm actually quite impressed by the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity team. I think that, I believe it's Debbie Owosu-Aki, who is the current executive director, and who I think is really pushing for a more progressive, a more inclusive, a more equity-focused response to current Canadian politics. You know, she's very clear and well-spoken about the different ways that, you know, LGBTQIA plus identities, race-based identities, Indigenous identities, you know, socioeconomic experiences shape different queer people's lives, and the way that different forms of violence and oppression then thus affect us. I think she's a really phenomenal intersectional activist. And so I'm very impressed by their political work, by their organizing. I'm just, every day I'm like, Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, phenomenal work. So it's been cool to watch them. And then sort of thinking about, you know, Nathan's point, I'm fortunate to be able to be a facilitator for a queer youth group here in London. And queer youth are brave. I think I often think like, oh, the kids are all right as long as they also have people who are supporting them, caring for them, telling them that like you're fine, you're allowed to. There was one kid who, I think every time I saw them, which was, you know, like every other month roughly, they were using a different name because they're like, I want to try this out. This feels more authentic to me today. And I was like, that's a phenomenal thing to do. I don't know if you're doing that everywhere else, but to do that here, to do that where you feel safe, and to say, I want to keep pressing until I figure out what feels most authentic to me. Like, that is so exceptionally brave and so exceptionally authentic in a way that, you know, I may never fully experience. And so I have a lot of faith. And I sometimes hate that answer, like, oh, I've got faith in the next generation, because it feels like you're offloading your responsibility to the current moment to another generation to fix. Or that's sometimes how I felt when I was younger. People be like, you guys are going to change the world. I was like, but you could change it too right now. And so I do get a lot of hope from queer youth, who I think are, you know, sort of regardless of this current political climate where we're seeing this rising, particularly rising transphobia, we're saying, no, I exist as I am trans as I am queer as I am whatever identity I feel that I am today, and you are going to respect it. I have so much love and respect for that. So yeah, I think there's two. One is like organizational, political action, and then the other is people showing up authentically as themselves every single day.
The kids really are all right. I feel like that is a great summary of it, because God, it is amazing to see what this up and coming generation of young queer activists are doing. And I say young as if we're not also all kind of in our mid to late 20s. I think we're also still young, but man, there's like 11, 12, 13-year-olds, and they are just, they're so incredible. And such a good point. Kind of to that effect, one of the things that I really recall being super meaningful as one of those young queer kids, which again, wasn't that long ago, but still feels a little while ago, was just some of the solidarity from straight allies and what that really looked like. And I know there's lots of jokes like, oh yeah, Macklemore, allyship, and all that stuff. But I think that now more than ever, it's particularly meaningful to have that solidarity from those who might not necessarily self-identify as queer, but who are still firmly on the side of supporting and uplifting those voices. So for each and every one of you, I would like to ask, what does solidarity from allies look like to you? And how can people effectively be good allies to the queer community, given the current context that we're in? I'd love to hear, I think, from Nathan, and then we'll go Olivia and then Miles.
When I think of solidarity, it makes me think of being in a space where somebody is supporting me and being myself, whether it's inviting a partner or joining me and going to a new space, whether it's queer or not, and just helping me be myself where I am. And I also don't see it as like a pinnacle state or like perfection. Like I don't think that's realistic for anybody. Um, I think solidarity is the effort and the willingness to learn if you do make a mistake. There's been multiple times where I'm with somebody who I consider an ally and a close friend, and they'll say something that is contrary to that, or they'll do something that's contrary to that. But then I think it's important to, like, if they are a friend, bringing them in and talking about, oh, where was this hiccup, or what's a better way to like show up for me, or for us to show up for each other, because I think solidarity is based in relationality, and that's an ongoing process that we have to figure out with each other, because we're all different people and we're all coming to each other from different places and in different states. So I think it also falls back on the patience and bravery, the patience to figure things out with somebody who's different from you, and the bravery to express yourself when something might happen and it's not okay, or even the bravery to celebrate something that you didn't think was, safe to celebrate, like your identity or who you are, or who you love. And that's how I see it.
Yeah, that's a really phenomenal question. I love what Nathan just said about the patience and the bravery part. I just thought that was a really, a really phenomenal tidbit. I think for me, what solidarity from allies can look like, I think it's multifold. Of course it is. How could it not be? I think that there's sort of an interest in, LGBTQ experiences and 2S LGBT experiences beyond sort of just what's, just me as an individual. I appreciate that people can just support, I appreciate when people are like, oh, I support you, Olivia. I'm like, yes. And therefore you also must support other 2S LGBTQ plus people. And therefore means you must also sort of be tuned in to when you hear transphobic rhetoric. You've also got to be tuned in when you hear when you hear colonial rhetoric. It also means you have to be tuned in when you hear anti-Black racism and the rhetoric surrounding that. It means you have to be tuned into other things. And so I think, for me, solidarity is sort of solidarity between all of our respective communities. And we might be sort of distances away from one another, but ideally our commitment to justice, our commitment to equity, our commitment to care, for me, it's a commitment to care. That's like where my form of solidarity comes from. That community care draws us all back to one another. And so I often think that, I am showing other community solidarity as much as I hope they are extending that to me. They are seeing like the systems that are against us, colonialism, capitalism, racism, so on and so forth. They are against all of us. I always say, like, when I'm attending these protests, I'm thinking, you're not that far off the chopping block. And I'm showing up right now for trans kids because it's really, transphobia that's getting the brunt of it right now. I'm showing up for that because I'm like, everyone else is on the chopping block. And so for me, solidarity is knowing that, showing up for that, and showing up sort of across different issue areas, even if you feel like, this doesn't really impact me. I don't want to go to a protest or a march on a Saturday. I have other things I want to do. It's showing up regardless and saying, like, I care about this community. I care about all of us. I care about all of our well-being. And then this one is perhaps more contentious, but I think that when I extend solidarity to other communities, and when communities extend solidarity to me, and we form genuine relationships, or the hope is that there's genuine relationships formed, is that I also want them to join in the fun. And that doesn't mean every event. That doesn't mean all the fun all the time. I think there's sort of that reasonable frustration. This is very queer bar specific, but there's that reasonable frustration that, like, lots of people have their bachelorette parties at queer bars, but they won't speak out when someone says a slur or when they say something homophobic. And so the expectation is, if you're going to come to the fun stuff, you have to speak out against the hard stuff. And I would also say, if you've been showing up to the hard stuff continuously, so you've been speaking out, you've been calling out people, you've been inviting people in to have hard conversations about why what they said was rooted in, violence or systems of oppression. To me, it also means calling them in sometimes and saying, like, come to the fun thing. I want people to be part of these communities because they also fill our cups. They fill all of us with joy. So I think that one's a bit more of a contentious opinion, but I think it's important to say, yeah, show up for the hard stuff, show up for the good stuff. Let's build against that burnout together.
That burnout is truly real. So I completely agree that we need to, like, collectively build our capacity. But on that note, with solidarity, I often think it's referred to as an individual action or this one thing you can do. But, Olivia, Nathan, both of your comments really hit on the connectedness and relationality of it all, and that it is people first and ultimately our connections with others. That's the most important thing. And so those individual actions, like, prioritizing listening, or, suggesting language changes when there's something offensive, or, reflecting on what you're learning. And if you're truly immersing yourself into the world of, another experience. And so I think those are ways in which people can be allies. And of course, there's always attending the protests and the and anything like that of any vocal event. But I think when we're also talking about solidarity for the queer community, it's also important to talk about how we must also stand in solidarity with other oppressed groups, as we can't expect to have allies without being allies to others.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And the reflection on intersectionality and just the ways in which struggles are so often a collective and shared element, I think is so important. And I really appreciate you all noting that. So we're going to do one more question, and then I think we'll open it up to any reactions, comments, questions from folks who are viewing today. But how does this work fit into the broader importance of human rights, as well as the broader efforts of conferences like this one? We'll go to Olivia, and then Miles, and then Nathan.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I think that, we just came off that solidarity question, where I think we talked about it's all interconnected. These systems of oppression, they affect all of us and they affect us all differently, but they are sort of a continuous force, and we have something to be unified against. We have something to work against. And we have sort of the same mechanisms of care we can extend to one another. And so I think this is so cheesy, and I'm really saying a lot of cheesy things today, but I often think, like, human rights aren't sort of like pick and choose. It's something that you show up for all the time for everyone, regardless. There's a lot of narrative right now sort of about, like, I think burnout and exhaustion and people feeling like, oh, I can't show up to another thing, or I'm witnessing, sort of simultaneous genocides around the world right now. Like, I feel like I'm pulled in too many directions. And in some ways I'm like, that feeling is very real, and I hear it. But also, when you're fighting against one thing, you're often actually kind of, simultaneously fighting against multiple systems of oppression. And there's a lot of there's a lot of energy in that. There's a lot of, like, unity in that, and knowing that, like, the efforts that you are engaging in, so long as you're doing them for everyone, are often they're often working against kind of, again, that same sort of system of power. When you're calling your rep to advocate for Israel-Palestine, when you are, boycotting different brands that are using child labor in the Congo, you are standing with other forms of human rights. When you're calling your MP to say, like, I think that queer kids should exist and I believe in them, and I don't think parents should be immediately notified if they change their pronouns at school, you're standing up for everyone. And I think that that's the beautiful thing about both solidarity and a commitment to human rights, is that you're fighting against the same systems. We're all in this together all the time. And there's a lot of beauty and connection in that. How does it fit into this broader conference? Again, it's not a platter. You can't pick and choose. Queer rights are human rights. The systems that we're working against are often interconnected, and we can find ways to relate to one another because of that. And so I think I'll sort of cut it there, as I often love to go on really long answers that then come back into one spot. I think
who's next? Is it me?
I think it's
okay. Amazing. I was like, wait. Anyway, so in the most simple way possible, I think that queer rights are human rights. There are multiple sectors in which queer people experience discrimination or barriers, whether that's in safety, education, health, the legal system, and to be quite literally taken for face value, I think. And within human rights, I think that that's one aspect that is common, is that we have to strive to be heard, and that, there's this dominant voice that kind of tells us what the narrative is, and then we all try and work around it. But I think with us, if we're looking at it from a human rights lens, we look at how can we uplift those who haven't had their voice. And I think if we're looking at the queer community, we are a prominent example. One thing you touched on, Alex, was, say 10 years ago, we were getting almost our first hint of queer media, and now we're saturated into it. But at the same time, we're also seeing higher levels than ever of hate crimes, discrimination. And so conversely, as these two things are rising, I think we need to center queer rights within human rights. And like Olivia said, realize the interconnection with the other forms of human rights, whether it's gender equality, labor rights, religious rights, anything to that degree. And so I think one of the themes of why it fits so well within this conference is we're talking about steps, strategies, ideas about how to move our society forward in a more inclusive and equitable way. And queer people, while we have made broad strides, and there's also a lot of diversity within the community, from those who hold a lot of privilege to no privilege, recognizing that people hold multiple identities. There is still a lot of work to be done. And I think that from a globalized level, the UN, though we may have many opinions on that, does also recognize in reducing inequalities as a priority, which does include queer people.
Thank you, Miles. When I think about this conversation around queer joy nested within the context of human rights, it makes me think of humility, in that there's so many different ways human rights can be infringed, and there's so many different forms of oppression that so many of us are experiencing. Humility is important in trying to understand where other people are coming from, and then reconciling that when one set of rights gets stepped on, maybe that's all you see for the moment, but they are all connected. And I think to get there, we have to focus on our humanity and our relationality in order to yes, be there for each other in a good way, even though sometimes there is that conflict and that friction of trying to understand each other. Yeah, sorry, I don't have too much more to say.
That's all good. Thank you all so much for that. We'll create space just for a moment for any further questions or thoughts coming in from the chat. Looks like we've got a Mentimeter link that folks are welcome to use to share as well. So just that's another option too. But also don't feel pressured to share too. I realize it's been 90 minutes midday on a Tuesday, and just being here and watching, I think, is something in and of itself. So we'll just give it one more minute there and see if anyone has anything they'd like to share.
I have a deep love for online events, and this is always the most, if everyone in the chat is also, or everyone viewing is also getting me saying, always a bit the most awkward part where you're like, will there be questions? How is everyone? Because you can't always see people. So if we get no questions, I just want to say thank you to everyone who did tune in and view.
All right, so I'm not seeing anything come in. I'm going to propose that we give folks back that bonus 6 minutes of their day. It's been so lovely just hearing all three of you sharing your experiences and your reflections. And again, 90 minutes on a Tuesday is a long stretch of time. We're coming out on the holidays. I know everyone's like very tired right now. So thank you all so much for that. And thank you to the folks who did tune in today. It's been really, really wonderful.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you all.